Clear your desk, loser, my boss bellowed, voice echoing against the glass walls. The hum of fluorescent lights felt sharp, almost physical. Stealing company funds? You're done. I froze as the CEO's son leaned casually against the doorway. Smirking like this was some private joke. My coworkers stared, mouths half open, eyes flicking between me and the termination papers he tossed onto my desk. What, no begging? My boss laughed. Pathetic accountant. Cat got your tongue. The paper slid across the surface. I stayed silent. Nobody had any idea who I really was, or the quiet storm brewing behind my calm, measured eyes. The alarm buzzed at 6:15 a.m., the shrill sound cutting through the quiet of my apartment. I slapped it off, squinting at the peeling paint on the ceiling, and the faint smell of last night's takeout lingering in the air. My kitchen was tiny, cluttered with mismatched mugs and a stubborn streak of coffee on the counter. I poured a cup, the steam warm against my fingers, and watched the city wake outside my window. Cars inching through traffic, joggers weaving past storefronts, a trash truck groaning in the distance. I sipped slowly, savoring the brief calm before the storm of emails, spreadsheets, and phone calls. Accounting wasn't glamorous, but it had rhythm. Numbers never lied, and deadlines kept me grounded. I liked the structure, the logic, the quiet satisfaction of balancing a chaotic world into neat columns. By 7:30 a.m., I was on the subway, earbuds in, letting the hum of the train and the scratch of my own notes on a tablet drown out the chatter around me. I often imagined the lives of strangers passing by. What brought them here? What kept them awake at night? But mostly, I thought about work, deadlines, and the small victories that made me feel competent in a world that often undervalued quiet people like me. Stepping into the glass-walled office, the familiar buzz of fluorescent lights and murmured conversations greeted me. I exchanged nods with Janine at the front desk, smiled at a few colleagues without really engaging, and slid into my cubicle. My workspace was neat, personal. Photos of a family I adored, a small succulent that somehow survived the harsh office air, stacks of neatly labeled folders. I prided myself on attention to detail. Small things mattered. Receipts filed correctly, budgets balanced, memos proofread. Nobody noticed the hours I spent double-checking numbers, ensuring mistakes didn't ripple through the company. And maybe that was fine. Recognition wasn't necessary. Efficiency, accuracy, reliability, that was enough. Still, there was tension in the office. The CEO's son, Lucas, had recently been promoted to a managerial position despite having no real experience. He swaggered through meetings, cracking jokes at my expense, and my boss seemed to tolerate it, if not encourage it. It was subtle, an eye roll here, a dismissive laugh there, but it gnawed at me. I noticed everything, cataloged every slight, every moment of condescension. Lunchtime was my sanctuary. I usually took a short walk to the park nearby, letting the cold air bite my cheeks and the sun glint off puddles from last night's rain. I'd watch children run, dogs pull leashes taut, and feel a quiet reminder that life existed outside the walls of corporate power plays. At my desk, I kept a small notebook, scribbled with reminders, dreams, and sometimes personal mantras. Patience is power. Truth lasts longer than lies. It was silly, maybe childish, but it kept me grounded. It reminded me who I was beneath the polished exterior of office attire, beneath the quiet nods and brief smiles. I wasn't just another accountant. I had focus, intellect, and a moral compass that refused to bend under pressure. That morning, as I sipped my lukewarm coffee and arranged my files, I had no idea the office politics, the subtle cruelties, and the impending humiliation would collide into the storm I'd soon face. But the seed of quiet resolve was already there, hidden in the way I arranged my desk, the way I studied numbers, the way I walked through the city thinking deeply while the world around me raced blindly. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Lucas, the CEO's son, had a way of inserting himself into meetings and presentations without actually contributing. At first, it was just annoying. He'd rephrase my reports as if they were his ideas, smile at the boss while I spoke, and leave me with the faint sense that the room had shifted in his favor. I told myself it didn't matter. I liked my work. Numbers spoke for themselves. Recognition wasn't required, only accuracy. But over time, the pattern became undeniable. Projects I meticulously organized were credited to him. Emails I drafted were forwarded to clients with his name on the signature line. The boss's approving nods and chuckles seemed to reinforce the lie. The first red flag came during the quarterly budget review. I had spent weeks reconciling accounts, triple-checking every expense report, ensuring no discrepancy went unnoticed. As I presented my findings, Lucas leaned against the conference table, casually interjecting, "This report shows what I was talking about in our last client call." As if the work had been his all along. The boss laughed lightly. "Exactly, Lucas. Well said." I bit my lip, forcing a smile, swallowing the lump in my throat. The room applauded, not for the data, but for the performative charm of a man who hadn't earned it. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the spreadsheets, replaying the meeting over and over. I realized, with a sinking certainty, that no one would protect the truth for me. The next weeks were worse. I noticed subtle exclusions. Emails I was copied on late, conversations I was deliberately left out of, minor but significant decisions made without my knowledge. One afternoon, I discovered Lucas had accessed sensitive financial files without authorization, manipulating numbers to make it appear that I had missed an irregularity in the accounts. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. He had engineered a scenario where I could be blamed, publicly, irrevocably. My mind raced. How long had this been happening? How many small mistakes were actually traps? My stomach churned with the knowledge that the groundwork for my humiliation had been laid carefully, deliberately over months. I remember the night vividly. I sat at my kitchen table, cold coffee at my side, staring at the printouts of falsified documents and manipulated spreadsheets. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. I had trusted my colleagues, trusted the system, trusted my own competence to speak for itself. And yet it wasn't enough. I felt anger, yes, but it was tinged with something sharper: disbelief. The realization that people I thought I could rely on had actively conspired to destroy me. The betrayal cut through the veneer of calm I had built around my life, leaving me raw, vulnerable, and trembling. Even at the office, surrounded by familiar faces, I felt utterly alone. Some coworkers gave sympathetic glances, but no one spoke up. The hierarchy, the charm of Lucas, the boss's favoritism, all of it combined into a wall of silence that pressed against me from every side. Each day, I walked past the polished floors and glass walls feeling smaller, as if my identity had been slowly siphoned out, replaced by a carefully constructed narrative that painted me as careless, incompetent, even dishonest. And then came the morning of the public humiliation. The moment when everything Lucas had orchestrated collided with the boss's theatrics, leaving me exposed and powerless. But even in the depths of betrayal, there was a flicker of something I hadn't yet named. A quiet awareness that I wasn't powerless, not truly. The boss didn't know me. Lucas didn't know me. They assumed the silence they had cultivated would break me. I clenched my fists beneath the table at home that night, staring at the ceiling as if trying to etch a plan into the cracks. I would not crumble. I would not beg. Not yet. Not until I understood the full extent of the betrayal, and until I found the leverage that would let me reclaim my truth. The storm was coming, but this time, I would be the one directing it. The humiliation unfolded like theater. That Monday morning, the office was unusually quiet when I walked in. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The air felt charged, heavy, like the pause before a thunderclap. I set my bag down at my desk, opened my laptop, and tried to steady my breathing. Then I heard it. "Clear your desk, loser." My boss's voice boomed from the doorway. He didn't bother to lower his tone. His words shot across the office, sharp and deliberate. Every head lifted. He strode forward, face red, finger pointed. "Stealing company funds? You're done here." My heart pounded, but my body stayed frozen. Lucas leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk curling his lips. "Dad already called the cops," he said, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. A murmur rippled through the office. Co-workers exchanged glances, some wide-eyed with shock, others tightening their mouths as though trying not to smile. Papers rustled, keyboard stilled. I looked at the stack of termination papers my boss tossed onto my desk. They slid across the surface and stopped at the edge of my keyboard. What, no begging? My boss's laugh was cruel, deliberate. Pathetic accountant. Cat got your tongue. The words landed like blows. But I swallowed hard, keeping my face unreadable. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, pressing down, waiting for me to crack. Sign them, he barked, tapping the papers with one thick finger. Or we had criminal charges. Lucas chuckled, shifting his weight with practiced arrogance. Better sign, or you'll be cuffed before lunch. My mind buzzed with the weight of it. The performance, the calculated cruelty, the certainty with which they assumed I'd break. Years of service, late nights balancing their chaos, catching mistakes they never noticed, all erased in a single accusation. And yet, beneath the humiliation, something else stirred. A strange calm. They thought they were ending me. But in that silence, I began to see the cracks. The timing. The dramatics. The overconfidence. They didn't want justice. They wanted a spectacle. And spectacles, I knew, often revealed more than they hid. Is it true? Someone whispered behind me. Janine at the front desk looked pale, her eyes flicking from me to the boss, then back again. Another co-worker leaned forward, eager for the drama, as though my ruin were entertainment. I inhaled slowly, forcing myself not to look away. My chest was tight, but my hands were steady. I said nothing. That silence unsettled them more than if I had shouted. My boss's jaw tightened. Lucas's smirk faltered for the briefest second before returning. Inside, though, I was breaking. My mind replayed the months of small betrayals, each one now clearly a step toward this moment. The way Lucas had accessed files without permission. The way the boss had praised him, dismissed me. The missing emails. The false numbers. It had been building to this. My humiliation wasn't spontaneous. It was manufactured, piece by piece. For the first time in my life, I felt the full sting of being powerless in a room where I had given everything. I was invisible, erased, framed. But even as the weight of betrayal threatened to crush me, a sharper voice cut through the noise in my head. Wait. Watch. Remember. They have no idea who you really are. I didn't sign the papers. I gathered my bag, lifted my head, and walked toward the elevator. The silence in the office was deafening. My boss barked after me. Don't come back here. You're finished. But I didn't turn. The elevator door slid shut, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to exhale. My reflection stared back at me in the polished metal. Pale, shaken, but alive. Beneath the fear, there was something else. A spark I hadn't seen in years. They thought they had silenced me. But in truth, they had just given me my reason to fight. I didn't cry that night. I sat in my apartment, the silence pressing against me like a living thing. The city lights spilled through the blinds in sharp lines, cutting across the floor. And I sat at the edge of my bed with my bag still at my feet. The termination papers, unsigned, lay crumpled in the bottom of it. I should have been terrified, jobless, accused of theft, reputation shredded in front of people who had once looked at me with respect. But instead, I felt hollow. Not empty, hollow, like someone had scraped me out and left just the shell. I replayed every moment of the morning. The way my boss's face twisted with practiced anger. The way Lucas smirked like he had been waiting for this exact scene. The whispers, the shifting eyes, the shame that clung to me like smoke. It was all too rehearsed, too staged. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even just greed. It was an execution. They had wanted me destroyed. My hands clenched into fists against my knees. Sleep didn't come. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, hearing my boss's laugh echo over and over. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lucas leaning against that wall, his smugness dripping like oil. By dawn, exhaustion burned behind my eyes, but my chest burned hotter. Something inside me had shifted during the long hours of the night. I had been quiet my entire life. I had endured slights, swallowed insults, let people step over me because I believed in keeping peace. I believed in hard work speaking for itself, in loyalty being rewarded, in patience paying off. But that day in the office had shown me the truth. Silence only made me invisible, and invisibility made me an easy target. I got up, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection was unfamiliar. Hair tangled, eyes rimmed red, mouth pressed tight. But behind the exhaustion there was a sharpness I hadn't seen in years. It was the look I had when I first left college. Hungry to prove myself, ready to take on the world. That hunger had been buried under years of being dismissed, underestimated, ignored. But it wasn't gone. Not completely. And now it had teeth. By the second night, the fear of losing my career was still there, but something stronger had taken root. Anger. Anger at the way they laughed. Anger at the way the office had stared like I was an animal on display. Anger at myself for letting them corner me without a fight. But anger, I realized, was only fuel. Fuel for something bigger. I couldn't just clear my name. That would be too small, too easy for them to brush off. If I came back begging for justice, they'd twist it, spin it, bury it under money and connections. No, I had to be smarter. I had to strike in a way they wouldn't see coming. The thought frightened me. Revenge had never been in my nature. I wasn't ruthless. I wasn't powerful. I was just me. But that night, as I sat with the glow of my laptop illuminating the dark apartment, I remembered something my mother used to say. They underestimate you because you let them. Stop letting them. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Slowly, deliberately, I began searching. Company records. Public filings. Tax documents. Every digital breadcrumb I had ever touched for them. Years of work. My work was buried in those numbers, and I knew those numbers better than anyone else alive. For hours I clicked, scrolled, downloaded. With each file, with each discovery of carelessness, of manipulation, of dirty little shortcuts they had thought no one would notice, the anger in my chest hardened into something sharper. By sunrise, I wasn't just hollow anymore. I wasn't just angry. I was determined. They thought they had silenced me in front of everyone. They thought the story was over. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I knew the numbers. I knew the truth. And I was going to use both to bring them down. I started like any quiet war. By watching. Mornings became reconnaissance. I took the long way to the subway so I could watch the office building from a distance, learn the rhythm of deliveries, notice which employees came early and who lingered late. At my desk I rebuilt the months that Lucas had tried to erase. I opened archived spreadsheets, recovered old backups from the cloud, cross-checked vendor invoices, and traced payments line by line until the patterns started to show themselves. Small, rational-seeming edits that, when stitched together, became a map of deliberate manipulation. Numbers don't lie, but people do. My job was to translate the lies into arithmetic that wouldn't fit any plausible explanation. I lived on coffee and the steady click of keys, the hum of my monitor like a metronome marking each tiny victory. The first real ally was someone I hadn't expected, Janine at reception. She'd been there years, a quiet fixture who kept the office running and, more importantly, noticed things other people brushed aside. One afternoon, when the corridor smelled of bleach and the rain blurred the windows into watercolors, I asked her to meet me for tea. I told her simply and plainly what I'd found. Her face shifted from curiosity to alarm to fierce, careful resolve. I thought it was just incompetence, she said, but this is planned. She slid an envelope across the table with trembling hands. Copies of notes she'd made when she overheard Lucas on the phone. Casual mentions of adjusting entries and covering small discrepancies. It wasn't definitive on its own, but it was a crack in the armor. Encouraged, I started pulling at threads that led to suppliers and contractors outside the company's immediate orbit. A vendor in Queens remembered deliveries that never matched the invoices we had on file. A small office supply company produced receipts with different account numbers. I called each one, trying to keep my voice steady, explaining the situation without giving away everything. I felt like a thief piecing together a map to someone else's buried treasure. But the treasure I wanted was the truth. The more I found, the more confident the pattern became. Lucas had created phantom expenses, routed reimbursements through shell accounts, and used his informal access to the finance system to nudge ledgers just enough to point blame at me if anyone looked. It wasn't clean work. Every small win came with a setback. The IT manager, when I confided in him, looked exhausted and told me the company's audit logs were complicated and missing data for certain months. When I requested the logs officially, HR emailed back with a polite refusal. Irrelevant to your termination, they wrote. The refusal stung like a slap, but it also meant something. They were afraid of what those logs might show. I couldn't rely on the same channels that had been corrupted. I had to create my own. So I went analog. I dug through old filing cabinets at home. Hard copies I'd taken during late nights and audits when I'd thought it prudent to have backups. Under the faint smell of dust and stale paper, I found a receipt taped to the inside of an envelope. A payment to a catering company the CEO's family had used for a charity gala, dated the same week Lucas had paid a vendor in our books. The receipt matched the bank transaction on a personal account. It was a small thing, but it was a tangible contradiction to the story they'd been telling. Tangible things travel, and paper has a way of demanding to be believed. Fear arrived in waves. My inbox filled with curt messages from the legal department. A terse letter suggested I refrain from unauthorized access to company materials. One morning, I found a note on my desk written in a familiar hand. Lucas's, wishing me good luck, with a smiley face, which read less like a jest and more like a threat. I learned quickly that power has many faces. Charm in meetings, legal threats in hallways, and the quiet confidence of people who believe they are untouchable. That belief made them sloppy. They grew bolder, and with boldness came oversight. They assumed I would break. Instead, I used their arrogance to find mistakes. I thought about hiring a private investigator, but the budget for that felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. Instead, I used the network of small kindnesses an unassuming life had built. A former intern who'd left months ago and still had copies of emails. A freelance consultant who remembered receiving oddly routed invoices. Even a temp in accounts payable who admitted she'd made entries at Lucas's direction and saved screenshots on her phone. Each person was a little risk, a little courage. I offered them something small in return, one-off favors, dinner, a safe place to talk, and they gave me what I needed, corroboration. There were nights when nothing went right. I spent an entire week compiling a dossier only to return to my apartment and find my laptop refusing to boot. A victim of what smelled suspiciously like sabotage. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I thought of how easily digital lives could be erased. Panic was a long, cold hand that reached for my throat. But panic also sharpened me. I called an old professor from law school. Someone whose office smelled of old leather and certainty. And he offered to recommend a forensic accountant. Within days, I had a professional looking over my files, turning raw data into a forensic narrative. Timestamps, IP addresses, mirrored entries, and a paper trail that led uncomfortably close to Lucas's workstation. I presented this preliminary work to a small group. Janine, the temp, the freelancer, and a lawyer I had finally trusted to take a look pro bono. We met in the dim back booth of a diner where the coffee was terrible, and the booths were sticky with decades of other people's troubles. It felt clandestine, and it felt right. The lawyer warned me about the dangers of going public too soon. Defamation countersuits, legal fireworks, and the risk that the company might try to claim confidentiality breaches to discredit me. The caution was necessary and cold. A reminder that truth without strategy can be used against you. We tried strategy and were met with new obstacles. I filed a formal complaint with HR and watched, heart in my throat, as they logged it, and then told me the matter was under review, while nudging the CEO toward damage control. At one meeting, the CEO himself spoke in a low, measured voice about the company's values, his hand on Lucas's shoulder. The display of fatherly pride, a performance engineered to calm the room. The image made my blood run cold. A family protected by corporate ritual. Still, the forensic report had teeth. It didn't argue motive. It showed coincidence after coincidence until the coincidence itself became implausible. The turning point arrived not with a dramatic confrontation but with a quiet, precise exposure. A vendor I'd thought complicit came forward unexpectedly after I presented a consolidated timeline. His conscience, combined with the fact that his own small business might be punished, moved him to provide bank statements showing direct transfers to an account that bore Lucas's initials. With that one paper, a series of small lies congealed into a pattern that a regulator couldn't ignore. We submitted a complaint to the state's Financial Oversight Board and, simultaneously, a criminal referral to the district attorney's office. The legal wheels moved slowly, grinding against corporate polish, but they moved. Yet even as progress came, setbacks lingered. The company lawyer sent a cease and desist accusing me of breaching confidentiality. My phone rang with numbers I didn't recognize. Someone sent an anonymous email suggesting my apartment had been entered. I learned painfully that courage often summons retaliation. But I also learned who stood with me. Janine left a note under my keyboard one morning. "We saw. We remember." The temp texted a photo of an invoice she'd photographed before it disappeared from the server. Those small human acts mattered more than any headline. It took months. Not because the truth was complicated, but because the people invested in lies had the luxury of time and resources. During that time, I learned to be patient in a different way. Patience no longer meant quiet suffering. It meant methodical persistence. I became an architect of evidence, building a case not on emotion but on documents, corroboration, and timing. The nights were long, filled with the metallic taste of fear and the hum of late-night calls. But every scanned receipt, every confirmed bank transfer, every witness statement turned the tide a little further. By the time the oversight board called to say they were opening an inquiry, I felt something like exhausted relief. The world hadn't yet changed. I still walked past the polished glass and felt the weight of accusation against my name. But the mechanism that had been used to humiliate me was now exposed to inspection. They had built a stage to burn me on. I had set a light on the stage and shown where the props were hidden. It wasn't satisfying in the way revenge fantasies promise. It was quieter, cleaner, and more enduring. Truth, translated into numbers and testimony, has a stubbornness that charm and intimidation cannot withstand forever. The day of the hearing felt strangely ordinary. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and old coffee, the kind of scent that clung to bureaucracy. I carried a folder under my arm, heavier in meaning than in weight, its contents collected over months of patient, sleepless work. Janine walked beside me, her steady presence a reminder that I wasn't walking into this alone. The hum of traffic outside seemed muted, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Inside the chamber, the company's representatives were already seated. My boss, Henry, leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his expression smug but tinged with impatience. Next to him sat Lucas, his father's shadow in a tailored suit, the same careless smile plastered on his face. He glanced at me and then at the table, where their lawyer arranged documents with the precision of someone used to winning. When the judge entered, the room shifted into stillness. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. The lawyer for the company began with a polished opening. Accusations rehearsed, delivered in a measured voice, painting me as a desperate accountant who had tried to cover my own theft. The words were sharp, but I let them pass over me like a storm I knew would break. When it was my turn, I stood. My hands shook slightly, but the folder steadied me. "Your Honor," I began, my voice quieter than theirs but certain. "What I'm about to present is not a defense in theory. It is documentation. Receipts, logs, bank transfers, each piece connected to a pattern that does not point to me, but to Mr. Lucas Harrison." A ripple of movement passed through the room. Lucas shifted, Henry stiffened. I opened the folder and laid out the documents in sequence, sliding them across the table toward the clerk. "This," I said, pointing to the first sheet, "is an invoice to a vendor that does not exist. And this," I placed the next page, "is the corresponding payment made to an account registered under the initials L.H. Not mine." The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Continue." I laid out emails next, printouts retrieved from backups, some confirmed by witnesses who had sworn affidavits. These were instructions sent by Lucas Harrison to junior staff, directing them to make manual entries into the system. Here are the screenshots taken before those entries were erased from the company server. Here, I added, sliding another page, are the bank records from the vendor who has testified under oath that payments were redirected. The company's lawyer interjected, his voice strained. "Your Honor, these claims—" "Sit down, counselor," the judge said firmly. His tone carried the weight of authority that brooked no performance. "We'll hear the evidence." Lucas's smile faltered. Henry's hand twitched against the arm of his chair. For the first time, I saw something break in their practiced confidence. I wasn't finished. Finally, Your Honor, I present the forensic report compiled by an independent accountant, confirming the manipulation of ledger entries originating from Mr. Harrison's workstation. The timestamps align with the very hours Mr. Harrison claimed to be meeting with clients. I paused, letting the silence stretch. Numbers don't lie, but people do. The judge leafed through the report slowly, page by page, his face unreadable. The only sound was the faint rustle of paper, each turned heavy as a gavel strike. When he looked up, his eyes fixed on Henry and Lucas with a gaze that was neither angry nor amused, just clear, sharp, and final. Mr. Harrison, the judge said, addressing Henry first. You accused your employee of theft. You publicly humiliated them, threatened criminal charges. Yet nowhere in your case is there acknowledgement of these financial discrepancies. Discrepancies that overwhelmingly implicate your son. He shifted his gaze to Lucas. And you, young man, are fortunate this is not already a criminal proceeding, though I imagine that may soon change. The room seemed to shrink around them. Lucas opened his mouth, but no words came. Henry reached for his lawyer, whispering furiously, his earlier smugness replaced by a kind of pale disbelief. My co-workers, seated in the gallery, leaned forward with wide eyes, whispering to one another. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred, broken only by the judge's final words. This court finds insufficient grounds for the company's claims against the defendant. In fact, the evidence provided raises serious concerns that warrant immediate investigation. I am forwarding this case to the district attorney's office for review. Proceedings against Miss Taylor, he nodded toward me, are dismissed. The gavel struck once. The sound echoed, clean and sharp, like a door closing on the lies that had shadowed me for months. I gathered my papers quietly, not triumphant but steady. Across the room, Lucas stared at me, his mask of arrogance stripped bare, revealing only fear and confusion. Henry avoided my gaze altogether, his jaw set tight, his shoulders rigid. For the first time since that humiliating day in the office, the balance of power had shifted. As I stepped out into the corridor, the air felt lighter, as if the building itself had exhaled. Janine squeezed my hand once, her eyes shining with quiet pride. I thought of all the nights of doubt, the long hours hunched over files, the fear that truth might never outweigh power. Yet here I was, still standing, still silent but no longer unseen. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The days after the hearing felt surreal, like stepping out of one world and into another that was familiar, but slightly off-kilter. I returned to my apartment, the quiet hum of the city below somehow different now, more alive. The morning light hit the cracked plaster of the ceiling in softer lines, and even the lingering smell of last night's takeout seemed less oppressive. I sat at my kitchen table with coffee in hand, watching people rush along the sidewalks, each lost in their own dramas, unaware of the battles won and lost elsewhere. Work no longer occupied the same space in my thoughts. The office, the emails, the whispered judgments, all of it had been stripped of power over me. People whispered, yes, but it was no longer fear that tightened my chest. Lucas's reputation had begun to crumble quietly. Colleagues who had once admired his charm now glanced at him with doubt. Even my former boss, Henry, seemed diminished, his aura of authority rattled by the knowledge that his son's actions had been exposed. The change wasn't dramatic in headlines or fanfare. It was subtle, like a stone sinking slowly into water, ripples spreading quietly, persistently. I spent time with Janine, walking through the park we had once gone to in secret, laughing quietly over the absurdities we had endured together. There was still tension, yes, lingering like shadows behind each corner, but we had shared something permanent, the courage to confront deception. I realized how much I had underestimated the quiet bonds that make people resilient. In facing betrayal, I had also found allies who were steadfast in their integrity. I began to return to the work I loved, not as an employee, but in small, deliberate ways that reminded me why I had chosen this path in the first place. Freelance accounting projects, mentoring former interns, auditing small businesses that trusted me. Each task grounded me, reminded me of my own worth. The public spectacle of humiliation no longer defined me. Competence, attention to detail, and ethical clarity did. Nights were still reflective, but no longer consumed by anger. I would sit by the window, a journal open on my lap, and write without a goal of revenge. I wrote about patterns, about deceit, about resilience. I wrote about fear, about courage, about learning to trust my instincts again. Slowly, the notebook filled with pages that were not just evidence or calculations, but meditations on growth. Each word anchored me, a reminder that justice is more than retribution. It is understanding, and the reclamation of self. Sometimes I walked past the office building where the humiliation had occurred. I didn't feel bitterness anymore, only a detached recognition of what had happened. The glass walls glinted in the sun, a reminder that transparency exposes everything eventually. I thought of Lucas, who still carried the weight of exposure, and Henry, whose pride had been quietly punctured. I felt no pleasure in their discomfort, only the satisfaction of having endured without surrendering my integrity. That was victory enough. I began to allow myself small joys again. Morning walks without checking emails, evenings spent cooking meals I liked, laughter over lunch with friends who had no knowledge of corporate dramas. My life felt fuller, not because the office had acknowledged me, but because I had acknowledged myself. I had survived, and in that survival, I had discovered that dignity is something you carry, not something others grant. Even as the world continued its indifferent motion, I felt a subtle shift in how I perceived challenges. The sting of betrayal had not vanished, but it had been tempered by the knowledge that patience, strategy, and truth could withstand even the most carefully orchestrated humiliation. My confidence was no longer fragile or reactive. It was steady, like the quiet pulse of the city at dawn, persistent and unyielding. And in the still moments, when the apartment was quiet and the sun turned the walls a soft gold, I realized that the story I had lived through was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, rediscovering the power to define myself, and understanding that justice, when wielded thoughtfully and persistently, is not loud or dramatic. It is enduring. I sit by the window now, the city humming beneath me, a soft, constant reminder that life moves forward, indifferent and unstoppable. Sunlight glints off the glass of distant skyscrapers, painting sharp lines across the floor, and I trace them with my eyes, imagining the paths we each take, some straight, some winding, some hidden behind the illusions we tell ourselves. For a long time, I believed my worth was tied to approval, recognition, and the fragile judgments of others. That belief nearly destroyed me, but standing in the courthouse that day, watching the truth unravel in quiet, deliberate detail, I realized something profound. Power is not always visible, and justice is rarely theatrical. It resides in patience, in knowledge, in the courage to act even when the world assumes you will stay silent. I had thought my defeat was final. Instead, it became the catalyst for clarity. I discovered that the storms we endure are not only tests, they are teachers. I think of the office, now left behind, and the people who tried to define me by fear and deception. They believed arrogance and spectacle could shape reality. But reality is stubborn. Truth is stubborn. And when you know it, when you have documented it, traced it, and breathed it into life through your own resolve, it becomes something that no power can erase. I have returned to my life quietly, deliberately. I savor small victories. A meticulously balanced spreadsheet, a morning coffee in the park, laughter over a trivial story with a friend. I am aware of my strength, my patience, my capacity to endure, and the fact that dignity is never given. It is reclaimed, nurtured, and carried within. Sometimes, when the sunlight hits just right, I see those lines of light and shadow across the floor and think of the office, the courthouse, the months of work, and the nights spent staring at the ceiling, plotting, questioning, learning. And I smile, not because of vengeance, not because of triumph over others, but because I remember who I was, who I feared I had lost, and who I have become. I am still the quiet accountant who watches, who measures, who observes. But I am also the one who refused to be invisible, who let truth speak louder than lies, and who finally understands that the most enduring victories are the ones we earn for ourselves. The lines of sunlight fade slowly, and I am content, carrying my own story forward, steady, unshaken, and free.